Hello and welcome to the Hive community made up of dynamic educators like yourself. I'm excited that you're here joining and journeying with us to create positive and impactful change in your classroom as well as your community. I'm your host, Michael Matera, sixth grade teacher, author, and presenter, as well as host of the Hive Summit. Huge honor. And today we have two sort of powerhouses with us. These presenters are passionate preachers of restorative practices. They are co-authors of the book Hacking School Discipline. And between the two of them, they have an impressive list of accomplishments. Brad was a middle school and elementary school teacher for 11 years. During that time, he was recognized as Teacher of the Year. Moving from there, he took a position as a principal and eventually the Director of Curriculum and Instruction in downtown Indianapolis. He is now Chief Innovation Officer and co-founder of Behavior Flip, the first software that utilizes restorative practices. His co-author, Nathan, is passionate about stopping the school-to-prison pipeline. Nathan is also co-founder and acting CEO of Behavior Flip. As a seasoned behavioral expert that utilizes vast experience to help make the best practices accessible to a global educational landscape. They are hardworking advocates on closing the achievement gap through implementing trauma-informed behavioral practices. Both of their works align with the goals of the Hive Summit to create positive and impactful change. It is my super pleasure to introduce Brad and Nathan to the summit. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. I super jazzed to chat with you guys. We had met at AMLE this past year, and I was super impressed with your work. And you guys are just down-to-earth great guys who are really trying to sort of make schools the best they can be. And I'm super honored to have you guys on the Hive.
Yeah, we love connecting, and we were super excited when you asked us. So, thank you.
All right, so you guys, let's start. I guess from square one. This idea, like from your book. Let's take from that angle. You guys wrote that book, Hacking School Discipline. Tell us about that, like the book itself, because you have an interesting angle of school discipline. Like we're not just talking about names on the board and detentions here.
Yeah, definitely. I can sort of start a little bit. When Brad and I were, coming up with the book and what we wanted to do with it, his experience and my experience was, sort of the perfect sort of, what we needed to put this book together. I came with, working 8 years in the juvenile justice field. He's been a teacher for, 11 years, a school administrator. So we were able to take a lot of this stuff sort of combined, and then sort of my admin experience as an educator as well, and put the book together. When we were looking at sort of the titles of the book, we brainstormed so many different really options. What we want to do is really focus on sort of whole child, restorative practices, social emotional learning, just skills, that are around that. When we settled on discipline, we wanted it to be very clear that, discipline is teaching. It's not this negative connotation that you have to look at with discipline, and it's proactive measures. It's building up those relationships. It's focusing on what this looks like. And a lot of times when something wrong happens, after we're trying to be proactive, after we're trying to do different things, people are, you sort of get in this spot where you don't know what to do next. Like you care about this kid, but they just threw a desk across the room, and you don't really know what to do next. And you've tried to build this relationship. You collaborated with the parents. You've done all these awesome things. But what do you do next? And a lot of times we fall to punitive natures, and that's what the research, the evidence, empirically you can tell that this isn't working. So when you start looking at restorative practice as a whole, and it's been around for several years in the justice field, probably about 15, 20 years now in education, but it's getting more and more sort of traction because people are trying it and it's working. So I think that when we put this together, we really wanted to give, some strategies, some tips, the introduction of, what this looks like. So then teachers could read that book and educators can immediately take steps to their classrooms and into those relationships.
Yeah. And a big thing with the book is that we wanted to make sure that there's a whole lot of buzzwords in education. There's a whole lot of things that are segmented or siloed. The reality is, how do we take something like growth mindset, mindfulness, restorative practices, social emotional learning, trauma-informed practices? We look at all these as separate animals or It's a curriculum. Like we have a social emotional curriculum. The reality is that when you're doing restorative practices, it's more than just the punitive side. It is much more than that. It's the proactive side. It's the building the relationships, it's connecting with kids. It is taking all of those things and making it one cohesive unit. When you're doing something that's restorative, you can do it from a lens of a trauma-informed educator. You can take it from the lens of giving the kids a second chance through the growth mindset kind of angle, giving kids lots of chances to get something right. The mindfulness comes into play when a kid is starting to get amped up, starting to feel like they're going to do something they shouldn't. So how do you take all of these other things that are existing in education and make them into one thing? And that's what our book set out to do. We wanted to make it so the teachers weren't having a whole bunch of different programs. We were just doing universal best practices that fit into all those buckets.
I love that, this idea of, sometimes we get these programs, and then as teachers, like school's built in silos, right? We have our subjects. Mm-hmm. Even if you're like a second grade teacher and you teach all the subjects, you still sort of separate out your day. Like, well, now we're in this little box and then we're going to go to that little box. But like you said, good discipline, good relationships, they don't fit in a little box. You don't say like, now we're doing advising, now we're teaching you how to be good people, but the rest of the day, I don't care about that. Like, that doesn't make an effective relationship when you work that way, right? So I love the idea that the book's really talking about embedding it into sort of your daily practice, like all day, every day, as opposed to like some broken off piece that you do at the end of the day, or every Friday we do this, or every Monday we do this. No, this is like in your class, period.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
That's awesome. So like on that note, like relationship seems to be the key. So we're obviously going to talk about relationships, and hopefully throughout these conversations, you guys share some of those best practices with us that we can go and implement kind of on that daily basis. But let's start with the foundation of just building and establishing relationships. Here we are at the beginning of the school year. We have all a fresh crop of students. Some people are meeting them online. Some people are meeting them in person. Some people are meeting them in person, but at a distance. So like, how do you establish relationships? And it doesn't have to be like COVID specific, but like, how do you establish relationships in any classroom?
Yeah. And I think that, when you're establishing relationships, you got to start out with meeting the students where they're at. A lot of times we want to sort of dictate what a healthy relationship is. A healthy relationship is, you mentioned that you play Minecraft. I have a son that plays Minecraft. Okay, now we're connected. We've got a relationship, or, something like that. We've got to understand that students perceive relationships different than we may perceive relationships, and everyone's got their unique life experiences. They're bringing in certain, different aspects. Like Brad was saying, sort of there's that trauma lens too with certain relationships. So we just need to meet students sort of where they're at, but we have to honor their life experiences, their dignity, and sort of move forward with what a relationship looks like, on their level. And it starts with, open-ended questions, listening to students and actually hearing what they're saying. And then, not just listening to respond, but listening to hear and sort of embracing that. If, a kid comes up to me and I'm having a conversation like, hey, what do you like to do outside of school? And they say Minecraft. I don't need to quickly connect the way that I know what Minecraft is to this kid to show them that I care. I just need to tell them, wow, that's really cool. Tell me about that. The more that we can open that up, that develops that healthy relationship with just listening and meeting that student where they're at. The more that we can also, establish that we're a safe person, especially with, that trauma lens. And then, as a nation, as a world right now, we're going through a collective unified trauma, and there's a lot of different ways that we can sort of perceive this, but one that we have to realize is, we have something that we can sort of utilize and build upon with making sure that students feel safe and where they're at. But it starts with making sure that they understand they can talk to us and they can look at us as a safe person as well. So treating them with dignity and honoring them, listening to them, opening to questions is such a great place to start.
Yeah. And we also have to look at relationships as, not just, and we were talking to Keith Hickman with the International Institute for Restorative Practices on our Facebook Live, Hacking School Lesson Facebook Live. He mentioned what he called token relationships. It is not just that superficial relationship. Just by being their teacher or being in your school does not mean I have a relationship with that kid. It is not, deep. It is just having a kid in your class is not good enough. And it does not mean, a relationship is a lot deeper, a lot more meaningful, a lot bigger than that. He went on to, talking about the parent connection. Are we not just connecting with the kid, but are we connecting with their families, and how? And all of these things do take time, which we'll allude to when we talk about feeding relationships. But when we talk about relationships, it needs to be more than just that superficial token. You're a kid in my class, and I say hi to you, and then I teach you math, kind of thing like that. And what the research does show is that when kids come into your room, you need to be at the door, greeting them, connecting with them, and saying their name and all those other things, and not just pronouncing their name correctly, for instance, is hugely important in establishing that relationship, learning their name, learning their likes. But I really like what Nathan said about, you don't have to force relationships with, okay, well, you like football. Well, I know somebody who likes football, who's my third cousin, and these kinds of things. So I like what Nathan said about that, about the listening component, is to actually take an active listening and an active interest in what it is that they are, passionate about. And do we actually know what the kid is passionate about beyond what their favorite author is in an English class, beyond their favorite scientist in a science class? Do we actually know what they're passionate about and what drives them at a deeper level?
Yeah, I think both of you did a good job touching upon truly getting to know the person. And as Brad's echoing here, Nathan's point of not sort of one-upsmanship, not saying oh, you like, well, I like. It's you're not listening to respond. Maybe as teachers, to build better relationships, you're listening to follow up with another question, explore that relationship on their side of the fence, on their terms. And then that kind of goes to what Brad's saying too, about it being on their terms. Different kids need different things. So some of them want I'm out in front, high-fiving them as they come in, and others want that space. But you have to get to know them so that you know which student needs which piece, and you kind of have to be all those things, right?
Yeah, and some kids have had experiences in their past where they haven't had the best experiences with the teacher, or they haven't had the best experiences. They haven't felt a sense of connection to their classmates in that room. They haven't felt a sense of belonging in that classroom. They've had teachers that might have been sarcastic with them before, or might have mispronounced their name, which I talked about before. So you have to keep in mind that you can't force a kid to immediately want to connect with you. You have to realize that some kids will come in and tell you their whole entire life story and things that you never need to know or want to know. They tell you too much information sometimes. But then you have those kids that are very standoffish with you for a while. And the thing is that you have to honor the fact that they don't necessarily want to connect with you yet on that level until they feel that trust, like Nathan was saying. And I like to say this, and we said this in the book, is to wear them down with relentless kindness. So don't take it personally that a kid isn't your best friend on day one. Be nice to them, smile to them, ask them how they're doing. Take an active interest in what they're doing, give them some affirmative, feedback and things like that. But just keep in mind that, when you're building a relationship, it's planting a seed sometimes, and you might not see that seed grow for a long period of time. You might not see that relationship really start to bloom until, second semester. Sometimes you'll see a kid, if you're a fourth grade teacher, in sixth grade will come back to you and tell you how much you meant to them. So it's not that immediate reinforcement or that immediate relationship that always is how things are.
I like the sort of investment in the future, even for our own thinking. As teachers, sometimes you want that sort of pop of hey, I did a fun lesson and everybody's smiling today, right now. But that's important and that's good, but that is really just a blip on the radar. But if you establish a positive, healthy, safe space for kids on a daily basis, while they might not, show it in that moment, you are changing the trajectory of that student's life for sure. And like you said, 2 years later, 3 years later, 5 years later, whatever, they, some of them come back and sort of say that was the moment I started to trust teachers, or that was the moment that I started to believe in myself. So that's a really important concept that you kind of laid out there, Brad.
And just to add on that too, I feel like, a lot of times, because, we talk about empathy works both sides, right? As a teacher, we have to understand where the kid's coming from. As the kid, they have to understand, where we're coming from, how their behavior impacts us. But we have to also remember that, with restorative practices, we push this, intrinsic motivation instead of this extrinsic. Extrinsic comes, extrinsic goes. That's sort of easy to control. Extrinsic is, if Brad did something really good, I'm going to give him a sticker. If he does something really bad, I'm going to say, hey, you're going to sit in the corner for 5 minutes or something like this. And then intrinsic is Brad wants to do good because he just wants to do good. Same thing with us as educators. We sometimes look for that extrinsic motivation. We want those smiles. We want those kids to come up and say, wow, that was a great lesson. We want and that's what we think is driving that. When we start realizing that, the intrinsic value of being an educator is that long-term success and building them up and making them feel whole, then we become more sort of fulfilled with our work as well, right? Because, working in the juvenile justice field, it took me years of realizing that, because like I would work with a kid and for several months when they were in a residential treatment care center, then, they may have got released and something really bad happens. I'd be like, I would just beat myself up about it. And I'm like, well, everything I did in the work, like, I did this anger management, but yet blank happened. And then I started realizing that that's not what it's about. That's the extrinsic stuff, and I'm focusing on the wrong things. I need to realize that every time you're speaking to a kid and you're impacting their life, that may have a successful help on their trajectory, but you don't really know. So you just have to keep that intrinsic motivation in your head at all times. All the work that we're doing with kids, we're not going to see that immediate gratification. It's going to be something a little bit more long-term, and it makes us feel more fulfilled when working with kids.
100%. Like as a teacher, as a classroom teacher, I got to tell you, like a lot of my work centers around engagement and designing like powerful and impactful lessons, but with it, it's all about building the whole child. Like I really like content for me is second. It's about that student. It's about building them as learners. And, part of that is, like you're saying, it's working with the intrinsic things inside them, making them more confident, more ready to sort of like be creative, but this takes time, and like social emotional learning like takes time. Like it's not like a lesson plan where you can just say, hey, like be confident, and then they're like, oh cool, I'll be confident now. That's great. No one's giving me that suggestion, right? Because it comes back to that relationship, right? You have to like truly be in a relationship. You have to sit with somebody. You have to be there and understand them. But when you do, and you actually tap into that internal motivation, like like I said, that's life changing. And then they start to develop those things of curiosity and confidence and creativity to go out and tackle future problems. So that's where they come back 2 years from now, 3 years from now, sort of saying, because of where you've laid that foundation, you've allowed them to sort of extend themselves into the future. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. And something that we're going to talk about in a little bit is the repairing of the relationship. But if you don't have that initial foundation with the kid, and then something goes down that is not so good, they're not going to want to listen to you and work with you in the same capacity. So, like if I take constructive criticism from somebody I don't respect, or I wouldn't ask for advice, I'm not going to hear it, and I'm not going to listen to it. So when we have that, and when they actually know that you're there for them, and they know that you got their back, and you know that you have their best interest in mind, when something does go down, which we'll talk about how to do that later, that's when it's really important, is that we've invested, like we're adding in currency, we're adding in into that account, so that social emotional, that relationship account, because sometimes we have to take out of it. Sometimes there's going to be a case where either I do something wrong, or I say something I shouldn't as a teacher. And Dwayne Reed, who we had in our show too, he likes to talk about apologizing to children and actually saying, sometimes the teachers mess up and we have to apologize. But when something goes down and something, is harder in that tough love, if you don't have that original, relationship, and it's very strong, it's just not going to be heard. And I think that's a lot of times. And what's that quote, Nathan, about relationships, rules without
relationships inspire rebellion, from Josh McDowell. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, I mean, like, you definitely have gotten us thinking about sort of the value of establishing those relationships. You've talked about, like, making it sort of unique to each student and meeting their needs and taking the time to know their needs. But like, all right, let's fast forward a little bit. Say we're a little bit into the year. I think that I have established those relationships. I have made this a safe space. How do I continue to feed those relationships so that it doesn't feel as though that was just a token relationship? Like, yay, I did these team building things in the beginning. I know you're a quiet student. I know you're the high five student. Great. I'm letting you have space. I'm letting you get a high five every day. But if that's where I leave the relationship, then that is a token relationship.
Absolutely. So I think that when you're looking at that next step of continuing to feed relationships, one is being mindful of it, right? And just realizing that, hey, once I establish a relationship, doesn't mean we're just good to go for the rest of this year. Like, we don't do, 2 weeks of icebreaker activity and be like, hey, man, my class loves me. I feel good. Like, our relationships are good. So just being mindful of it, because again, we have to understand that everyone comes at different levels. We have to accept that. One thing that we really think is a great way that teachers can support this is through community building circles, check-in circles with students. And this is something that you can do, every morning. You can do a couple times a week. You just want to be sort of consistent with it. A circle is sort of a safe, supportive space where, you can talk about different topics, even outside of school, just something fun. You can say, let's say you have a younger group, you can say, I want everyone to talk about how they're feeling in weather terms only. You can have sort of that talking piece and allow different people sort of be empowered to have that talking piece and be that one to talk, even on a virtual setting, because Brad and I have been doing a lot of virtual circles recently. You can do it all sorts of different ways as well. You don't have to have a in-person talking piece as well. You can have something where, people sort of raise their hand, or you can have sort of a list and call on names. And if they want to talk, they can, do a thumbs up and unmute themselves, or thumbs down if they don't want to talk, anything like this. But you want to really support giving that voice out into that community building and into that relationship more than just interpersonally, because we have to realize that when we're building relationships, it's not just with us as educators, it's with that dynamic of that classroom, sort of that classroom culture. And when we start with those relationships, when there's, misbehaviors occurring, or when there's challenges occurring with, let's say we go back in person for a couple months and we go back, virtually. And then maybe, a couple months later, we talk about, something a little bit more hybrid. I mean, like, no one really knows what's going to be laid out there. So the more that we can realize that we have a safe structure built into feeding those relationships and hearing our students, that helps offset a lot of that anxiety, helps offset a lot of that, I need to call up 30 students right now and check in with them, and then have some sort of activity where I'm bringing their voice in together, then a collective sort of commitments of next steps, do that as a group, do a circle and facilitate that.
Yeah. And I like to talk about it like think about your wife or your significant other, and you tell her you loved her 3 months ago, and but I love you, right? So I don't have to say it again for 3 months. Then you don't bring flowers, you don't go on dates, and you don't and you kind of get complacent in that relationship. So I look at it that way. It's not just that initial I got you to like me kind of thing, and we like each other kind of thing. It is the feeding, and with the feeding, it's a lot about those classroom circles, like we like to talk about, we like to do with our kids. It's all about that voice and feeling heard, and it's about shared power in the classroom, getting that collective efficacy, getting that collective buy-in with the kids, so that I feel like my voice actually matters and I feel heard in this classroom. I feel a sense of belonging in this classroom. There's what we call shared power in the classroom. I'm part of the decision makings that go on in here. I help co-construct some of these classroom norms. I help, and when we look at like something like restorative pedagogy, I don't know if you've heard of restorative pedagogy, but we've heard of different kinds of pedagogies, right? We've heard of the more traditional approaches, and we've heard of, top-down, teacher makes lesson, teacher makes objective, teacher decides what success looks like, teacher is the person directing all of the conversations, teacher is the one making all the rules. When we look at a restorative pedagogy, it's that shared power, that collective commitment. Kids are co-constructing some of the rubrics that might happen with the project. Kids are co-constructing some of the success criteria. Kids get to solve their own problems. Like, we do reactive circles when something goes wrong in the class, and the kids help come up with what it is we need to do as a class to make sure that we all get back on track. It's that vulnerability where I can raise my hand and say, or ask my kids for feedback. Hey, yesterday, it didn't seem like we all understood. I looked at my little exit ticket, and a lot of people didn't seem to grasp this concept. What could I have done better? So it's that vulnerability you have to show as an educator too, in the classroom. It's again, I talked about Dwayne Reed talking about apologizing to the children. I reacted harshly. I said, everyone get in your seats now, and yelled at them, instead of having some patience or figuring out that the kids are bored out of their mind because I didn't exactly set this up correctly. Everyone's confused because I didn't necessarily do a good sequence and structure in my lesson, or I didn't, I'm doing something that they don't know how to do yet. So when you have that vulnerability as a teacher and the kids see it, it's not a weakness. I look at it as a strength. I look at it as the kids are more willing to buy in to what it is that you're doing in the classroom when they have that collective and when they have that shared power.
Yeah, I in my session, actually, I talked a little bit about, one of the things I talked about was this idea of sort of frequent check-ins with students, I don't even want to use the word survey because it's not like you're asking them like some 10-question thing, but the ultimate point here is it is their class. Like, you are facilitating their class. It's not your class. Like, so this idea of giving them more and more agency in your class, more choice in your class is important. And you guys are taking it from sort of a psychological perspective, right? That like we have safety here, we have security here, we're loved here, and that their voice matters here, right?
Yep.
And I'm gonna be honest, you might not get through as much curriculum. You might not get through as much curriculum when you have kids taking part in the learning process, but I will guarantee you that the kids are going to learn a whole lot more. So you might not get through page 300, you might get to page 250, but I guarantee you out of those 250 pages you do in that book, the kids are going to know a whole lot more content. So they might remember 70% of 250 pages versus 20% of 300 pages. And I'm not a huge advocate for the book, but I'm just saying hypothetically content and volume of information that you might expect to learn in the class. The kids are going to learn a whole lot more when they're part of the process than it is when they're being dictated to and, not having any of that shared power.
Well, I think too, it's like we have to empower our students and we have to like get them to recognize the fact that like they live in a world that it's about the skill of learning. It's not necessarily just about like what little factoids you have in your head. It's about like, are you empowered as a learner? Are you confident enough to go on YouTube and learn how to change the oil sometime in the future, right? Like, are you going to be that person? Or are you going to be like, I'm helpless. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that. And I am totally with you, Brad. We can slow down the content sort of climb if it really means we're exercising the mind so that they're confident and they're creative in their solutions and their problem solving, so that really no matter what content they need in life, they will be able to acquire it.
Sure.
Yeah. So, Nathan, for feeding relationships, I gotta ask, like, Brad sort of talked about circles and some of these things, and he also hinted at it's going to take a little time when we invite them to sort of design the course with us. But we've also talked and heard about these circles in terms of sort of a stop moment or a check-in moment, or like we have to solve this problem. What does it look like? I'm a classroom teacher. I got so many minutes with my kids. I only see them every other day. How does that stop moment look? Is it something you process the next day? Like, hey, we had this problem yesterday. I'm going to begin my lesson with this stop moment. Or is it like, pencils down, we're going to talk about this?
Yeah. Either way, there's a lot of different ways to do reactive circles. One thing that I want to point out first is you want to make sure that you have a good circle process down. That's something where like they understand what a circle is. They have a good list of sort of collective commitment, which are the expectations of the circle. They know, who talks one at a time. You have to have the talking piece virtually or sort of imaginary, whatever that may be. They have to have sort of that time limit of how much time they can speak, because if you have a class of 20, 25, 30 students, you can't give every student a minute, even 30 seconds to speak. You're going to have to do something sort of quick and to the point, so you don't get students that may get that talking piece and want to continue to go. If a situation occurs and it's big enough where I think I need to get my collective commitment, catalyze that investment into change for whatever's taking place, I may call a circle right then and there. Let's say that, I have a student that, students in the back rows making noise every time I turn around. I don't know who it is. They continue to make that noise, I have the choice of sort of, doing basic sort of walking around, positioning myself closer to the back of the room, or I can say, hey, let's circle up. And what you want to do when you do circle up in that time is you want to make sure that you're very goal specific about what your prompt is. So what a prompt is of the circle is what you're going to be discussing. So you make sure that everyone knows those collective commitments really quickly. And then you as the educator to, explain what that prompt is. It's not going to say, hey, there's someone making noise. I need to know who it is. And then I get someone to sort of raise their hand and point and I get a fight in that classroom. You want to talk about what took place in that situation. So, quickly, if I saw students making this noise, I decided I want to invest some time into this. I said, hey, let's circle up. We got 5 minutes. That means that everyone's got, 10 seconds or less to talk. I just want 1 or 2 words. How do you feel when you feel interrupted? Not about this situation, just overall. How do you feel when you feel interrupted? And then just get some boom, boom, boom. What that does is building empathy around how I may be feeling as the educator, how other students might be feeling, and is not focusing on the exact problem at hand, because we don't have, this isn't a processing group. This is a classroom. We have to continue to go, but I need those students that were making these noise, that understood this, to hear from more than just me. Because let's say that, they may think it's funny when I turn around or flip the light on or off. I want them to understand that this is something that's impacting others. If I get people in, again, we do a lot of sort of training around what circles look like, so I want to make sure I'm giving good justice to it. But, there's a lot of ways to sort of adapt to if you start to see, some acting out behaviors in that circle, or the students that were making the noise, says, well, I think it's funny, and everyone laughs. So, you want to be really well equipped to handle what a circle looks like and be able to sort of adjust that. Like Michael, to your point, let's say that, something took place and I want to address this the next day, and I'm more of a processor. I'm going to come up with a really good way to sort of address what took place. And then we're going to come up with sort of a plan of action as the class. And you could do that at the start of the day and be like, hey, yesterday I heard, a lot of noises taking place. That's why I rearranged the desk. This is what we're going to do here on the future. And then sort of present, how you want to address what took place. But again, you want to be very mindful that you don't want students to call out other students. You don't want to focus on the exact behavior. You want to focus on, the problem that's taking place for the rest of that class, sort of that collective commitment.
I really like I'm picturing my 11-year-old students, the sort of cool sidestep you did. Like, clearly something's happening and they're probably going to assume you want to directly address, like, who in that back row is talking, right? Yes. And I love the sidestep of making a connection to them, like, saying who likes it when somebody walks in front of the TV. Like, nobody likes that, right? So then they're all like, well, it's frustrating, I missed the thing, I can't see. And then, like, to sort of make that connection, like, there are other kids in this room that were trying to listen, but you in the back talking. I mean, not that you would directly call it out, but I just love that sidestep, that you're getting at the same concept without directly sort of calling people out, and you're building empathy with those kids.
Yeah, and it's not going to be an immediate, you do this once, then those students come up afterwards and say, I'm so sorry for yelling this in the back of the classroom. We've all worked with kids for years, right? We
That's not evident.
Yeah, but again, you're building up this collective culture and this collective commitment into this investment into this. So, right after the circle, you may hear something else. But again, instead of you having to address it, you might get 3 or 4 students sort of look back and be like, really? Like, and that might address it. It's sort of like that. Like, Karl Marx's like invisible hand with economy. It's sort of like the same thing with behavior monitoring, right? It's that invisible hand. I want the rest of the classroom to be able to control this, so I don't have to be this dictatorship and sort of be like, you do this, you do this, you do this. It's more of like, hey, we're all in this together. This is how this impacts other people. Like, why are you still doing this? No one thinks it's funny anymore. And that's going to change the behavior a lot more than me even pulling a student out in the hallway, doing a referral, calling the parent, anything like that, because we have to understand, with restorative practices, what's driving behavior. One of the top 3 reasons what drives behavior is attention-seeking behavior, right? So if a student wants to get attention in some way, shape, or form, sometimes they don't do it in the most positive way, and they're still going to get that attention. So we have to understand what's driving the behavior, and if we give them that more attention and call them out and say, okay, you're going to sit up here. Like it's going to sort of feed that, and they're going to want to kind of sort of embrace that. And that turns into repeated behaviors and not sort of around that collective commitments.
So I like that you're both sort of talking about here is under sort of feeding the relationship. It seems like we have sort of two things going on. One is doing these sort of circles to sort of let them feel the safe space, build that empathy, let them have some agency in your class. But also I like this idea of not falling into the trap of almost checklisting a relationship. Well, we did the team building, done. Like we did have a fun Friday once, done. Like, hey, we did take them on a field trip, and I whatever, made some funny jokes on the bus, check. Like, it has to be an ongoing relationship centered around meaningful things. And both of you are expressing the fact that what you're doing is you're allowing the student to really be in partnership with you.
Yeah, mm-hmm. For sure.
That's big. Now I have to sort of turn it, I hate to do this, but turn it a little bit like relationships get damaged, right? Yep. Students, I teach middle school, like they are all passion, all heart, right? And, one misstep, like they can get pretty ticked off and they can really feel like this relationship's damaged. And sometimes, to your guys' point, we don't even see it that way. Like, whatever, like I just said one little thing, and wow. So we're going to have, it's going to happen. You're going to have some relationships that get dinged and dented, and that's never what you want. So how can we go about repairing those relationships?
Yeah, and I read this the other day, and this is a great quote or a great point. But when we look at relationships being damaged, it's not always the kids damaging it. Sometimes it's the adults damaging it through things like sarcasm. Wow, thanks for showing up today, when they come in 3 minutes late, versus, hey, I'm so glad you made it. If I was a kid, I would much rather, if you think about a staff meeting, imagine if the principal, when somebody came in 3 minutes late, said some kind of comment to that like them, or said something like that. So, and there was this great quote, and I'm going to butcher it, but basically, when you think about an axe and you think about a tree, that that the tree remembers when the axe chops, right? But the axe moves on to the next tree. So the tree will remember that kind of thing. So when we say something to a kid that's kind of harming, and we didn't mean it to like ruin their day, but they can internalize that kind of thing, and they can think. And Nathan, how many times did kids go to your office, that teacher does not like me? Like, how often did you hear that when a kid got in trouble, and the reason why they were there, the first thing they said was, that teacher does not like me? Do you think they actually believe that too?
Yeah. Perception's reality.
Yeah, so they actually think that. So one thing we said could actually be this thing that drives a wedge in that relationship. So we need to apologize to kids. We need to realize that our words are huge. Our words really matter. But we just have to be willing as ourselves, as the adults, when we say something out of line, or when we yell at our class, or when we are having a bad day and we take it out on a kid, that we need to self-check. We need to make sure that we are, thinking metacognitively about our lesson, about our interactions, about things, and then we need to repair them ourselves, because empathy goes both ways. It's not just, did the kid make it right with me? It's also, did I make it right with the kids, or things that I damaged? And another thing I want to talk about with repairing the relationships, we need to think about it as, okay, if a kid does something that they shouldn't, do they in fact understand why it was what they did was wrong, and how it impacted others? How did it impact the learning environment? Why was this something that was an issue? And not only did they understand that, you build that empathy for what they were doing and how it impacted others, but did they fix that thing that they damaged? So traditional discipline is, if you get in trouble, I kick the kid out of the class, they go down to the office, they serve their lunch attention, they serve their detention, then they come back in the class tomorrow. But the reality is if I get in an argument with my wife and she makes me sleep on the couch, or, and not that you all have ever gotten in fights with your significant others, but let's just say hypothetically that you did at some point. But if they kick you out, you're sleeping on the couch, or they kick you out and something happens where, they don't make, like, we don't get dinner. I don't get dinner made for me for the next 3 days because she's mad at me and says, go order it yourself. after that 4th day, things are not fixed. So that's what we need to keep in mind is if we didn't actually hash out what happened, if I don't understand her perspective, if I don't know what it was that caused her to get upset, and I didn't actually apologize and make it right with her, it's not going to be repaired. Time does not just make things better. You have to actually hash it out, and you have to actually take accountability and ownership for your actions. So it's all about when we repair the harm in those relationships. When the kid comes back into your classroom, suppose they did get kicked out because they cussed you out or something like that, that awkwardness doesn't just go away. That kid doesn't feel like you like them. That kid doesn't feel like they belong in that room until you actually talk about it and the kid understands. Because when I talk to that kid and I seek to understand that behavior, why the kid cussed me out, it could be because that kid was having a very bad day. It could be I said that things to that kid that kid's mom says to that kid, and that really triggered them. It could be something with trauma that happened in their past that could have set them off. So I have to understand that behavior myself. And then I can talk about it, then I can address it, then I can give them a skill such as when you're starting to feel angry, here are 3 things you can try. You can try pressing your hands against the wall. You can try counting backwards from 10. You can try mindfulness where you're putting yourself in the moment or you have pleasant imagery. Here's some things you can try next time. But if I don't give that kid that skill, the next time they get mad, they're going to probably do the same thing again in the same way. And they're also going to think that I don't like them because I kicked them out, then they came back, and then we just moved on with life. So it's all about not just the talk. It's not about fixing the behavior. It's about reestablishing that relationship as I care about you and I still like you. I didn't like what you did, but I like you and I want to fix this with you. And that's really important.
I like it. So like seeking, a good teacher should seek not to control, but to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think it's really important when you're looking at, misbehavior overall, that we have to remember that when we're interacting with our students, with discipline practices overall, discipline as a unit, it's 80% of the time proactive, sort of those first 2 components that we talked about, 20% of the time reactive. If we start realizing that we're being way more reactive than proactive, we need to start investing way more time in that proactive measures. So some of the stuff that Brad was saying, that should just be that 20%, reactive. And the biggest thing with sort of the paradigm shift from punitive to restorative is you are focusing on the harm that was caused into the relationship. It's not just you did this, now you get 1 day of in-school suspension. You did this, now this happens, because we understand that breaks that relationship. That doesn't teach, which is what discipline's about, teaching. So we have to realize that, there's all these different components we got to look into, but we have to make sure that we're focusing on repairing the harm. And when you're looking at repairing the harm, there's 3 different types of consequences that we talk about. One is natural consequences. A natural consequence is, I ran too fast through the kitchen. I stubbed my toe. I'm probably not going to run through the kitchen next time to go get that drink with those socks on. Logical consequence is something that makes sense. So if I am a student and I'm throwing food in the cafeteria and I cause, a food fight in the cafeteria, instead of me sitting a day in school suspension, get a phone call home, how about I clean up the cafeteria and then I talk to the janitor about, everything I need to do to clean the cafeteria. I don't just need to sweep the floors. I need to mop. I need to clean all the tables. I need to clean the wall. So then I empathize and I realize what I caused the harm to in that cafeteria. That's going to change that behavior a lot more than sitting a day in school suspension. That's what a logical consequence is. And then a restorative consequence is taking a little bit of both. It's making something that makes sense with that logical component, and then also something that's natural. If Brad and I have a disagreement and we don't talk for 3 days, we're like his example, except a little bit different with our relationship. We don't talk for 3 days, and then all of a sudden, I call up Brad and I ask him for a favor. There's going to be it's damage there. I need to own this with him. And that's natural, for me to say, Brad, I'm sorry, I was having a rough day. I shouldn't have been so short. I should have, respected you more and let you sort of finish, your thought, and then us collaborate together because, that's respecting you more instead of just sort of cutting you off and say, nope, this is what we're going to do with something. That's natural. I'm owning that. It makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. It lets Brad have a chance to be spoken to. And then when you add something logical, well, Brad, since I did this is what we're going to do for the next couple of days. I want to make sure that when we're starting conversations, you talk first. I'm not going to talk for the first 5 minutes because I think I start, rambling on. I think I do this type of stuff. That's my way of logically doing this. And then Brad's going to feel not just heard, but he's going to feel like that repaired the relationship. And when we start looking at misbehavior in that lens, and there's so many creative ways to do this. And, we talk about some in the book, that's what we do a lot of our trainings around, is how schools can do this just on the teacher level, the admin level too, with some of this 20% reactive, and just making this sort of a culture. But again, I always want to continue to sort of harp in that, it's 80% proactive, 20% reactive. This is just that 20%.
I like that like litmus test that any of us could do, just to be mindful of that as you move forward, that sometimes it's going to be reactive. Definitely, we all feel like it should be more proactive. Teachers are built that way, with trying to make systems in place to sort of reduce and manage, for sure. But I like that simple like check-in, like, have I been doing more reactive things? Because if I have, like you said, let's double down and work towards more the proactive side of things, and work on what we've already talked about here. Have those circles, build those relationships, and make sure it's not a token relationship. Actually invest time.
I also think that, just like we said at the very first components with establishing relationships, we have to also understand where the student's at when we're repairing the relationships. If a student is triggered and they just flipped over a desk and we're trying to talk to them in the hallway, we're going to make that situation turn from 0 to 100, pretty quickly. We've got to understand where they're at. And that's where some of the mindfulness stuff that we talk about, which is based out of dialectical behavioral therapy, a lot of that stuff comes in handy. We have to understand that, the younger the student is, the less developed their brain is, which means that amygdala, which is that fight, flight, or freeze response, is still going to be responding quickly. That's what keeps us safe, right? So if a situation occurs, that amygdala is still firing. It's still letting them sort of dictate, their emotions and how they're going to be acting. But the prefrontal cortex, which is that processing part of the brain, that CEO of the brain, isn't fully developed. And again, for a female, it's like 21 to 23. For a male, it's 25 to 27. So when we're thinking about, Michael, your 11-year-olds, they're not thinking like that, right? But their amygdala is thinking like that, though. Their amygdala is going to keep them safe. We walk into a classroom, we can be the happiest we've been, pumped up, have a great lesson, but we have some sort of micro expression on our face, and it triggers the student. And then all of a sudden they're like, well, they're mad at me and they don't want to do this type of stuff. And then they start like, pushing away. And then we're like, what are you talking about? We got this awesome lesson. And then you start trying to push that relationship, and then it turns into something bigger. We've got to understand that all students are coming to us from, different backgrounds, different ways of life. And we have to understand sort of where they're at in that moment. There's a window of tolerance for processing stuff, and that's 20% reactive. If we see a student that's in a hyper arousal or hypo arousal, that means that we have to do something to get them back into that window of tolerance. Hyper arousal is when they are feeling overreactive, unclear, distressed, like just emotions are running wild. Some of the hypo is more lethargic, depressed, that type of stuff. So if we see a student in one of those two different, sort of windows, we have to see if we can help them get more regulated. And that's where the mindfulness comes in. That's where processing time comes in. If I need students to switch chairs right now, they've talked, I gave them a preview, I did a warning. Now the consequence is, hey, I need you to move chairs. If I stand over the top of the student until they move chairs, I'm going to trigger opposition. I'm going to trigger more anxiety, and I might turn that situation big. If I'm to say, hey, we talked about this already, I need you to move up here, you're going to sit up there for 5 minutes, I'm going to walk away, you got 2 minutes to move chairs. If you don't move chairs in 2 minutes, we're going to have a bigger conversation. Let's just, and then walk away. Let them process it. Don't stare at them, anything like that, because everything that we do within those 2 minutes are going to trigger more amygdala responses. So the more that we can understand where the student's at, just like when we're establishing relationships, the better we're going to be able to process those situations and not turn something small into something bigger.
And it's not about winning. That's the thing that we can't get out of our heads sometimes. It's about winning. It's about, well, that kid can't talk to me like that. And if that kid talks to me like that in front of the class, then I'm going to look foolish. I'm going to look like I don't have control of my class and things like that. So it's not about winning. It's about connecting. It's about making sure that kid feels safe again, so that I can talk to that kid in a way that can get them to actually understand and see why they're acting that way, to give them the voice in that process. But the first thing you need to do in that situation is get the kid back down and co-regulate and get them back to a point where they can have a conversation with you. So I like how you talked about that, Nathan. It's not about that immediate, oh my gosh, this kid is freaking out. And then, well, what can you do to fix this as this kid's still in the chair, kind of thing like that. So it's all about the co-regulation. It's all about timing. It's all about knowing that, yes, this might take an extra 5 minutes, but it's going to take a whole lot less time because that kid is not going to start throwing things, or that kid's not going to attack you, or that kid's not going to do something that is much bigger down in the office because I took those 5 minutes to take care of that situation in a way that was, gonna really work with that kid.
Well, thank you. I mean, like, both for sort of that last piece, really powerful stuff to like recognize sort of the science behind what's going on. And I think when we understand that, like, we then can approach it in a meaningful and respectful way. And, you know, time is so valuable, and I hear it in both of your talks about how, like, you know, if we do this, if we invest a little time here, we get time on the other end. I just want to temper all of that with the advice you're both giving, though, is to establish good relationships. We shouldn't have to sort of figure out where the time investment's going to pay off on that. Like, it's just ultimately where we should begin, right? And we should maintain that, and whatever gets done after and above that, like, we'll just realize that's meaningful things that happen then. So I don't know if we always have to qualify it with a time trade-off, you know. It's just what we should do.
Yeah, and I like to say too, with restorative practices, like, it's not just what we do with our kids. It's not just how we act with ourselves. It just turns into this way that we interact with people, you know. And again, I'm not trying to get to this, like, you know, higher level sort of talk and stuff like this, but like, when you start looking at all of your relationships in your life and you start looking at those dynamics and saying, when something wrong happens, instead of quickly getting, you know, because we're going to get upset, we're going to have this type of stuff, but being able to give someone the voice and process through something and focus on the relationship, it makes everything more easy. And I mean, you know, there is a school that Brad and I were at in Tennessee before, you know, the COVID situation happened, and one of their guidance counselors came up to me, and you know, he was a bit newer. It was his first year at the school, so we were talking a lot about how to establish relationships with, you know, some work with him. And he was like, "Hey, I tried this with my wife and my mother because, you know, there's been a lot of stuff going on with, you know, her and her, you know, both sides, and they're like, I sort of just like did that stuff that I do with the kids and sort of did a mediation and, you know, asked stuff." And he's like, "It really worked." And, you know, and I was like, of course it does. Like, because like, it's not just like education. It's not just, it's the way that we look at stuff and say, we value relationships. And when something happens, instead of quickly labeling it, quickly saying, okay, what consequence do I need to sort of push out there, saying, what can we do to fix this? It just makes everything so much easier. And then the time that we may have been investing in some of that 20% reactive becomes so natural. You know, I've been doing this stuff for, you know, 12 years now, and it's so much easier to talk to a student about, okay, well, you did this wrong. What are you going to do to fix it? And like, just processing through what that looks like. It's way more easier than me sending out a bunch of suspension paperwork, sending them back at home where I know they're not going to be supported, you know, if their parents are at work or it's not the situation, and just saying, what can we do to fix this, and sort of building that student back up in that environment where there was harm caused. It makes life easier.
Well, I mean, thank you guys both for coming on and sharing your expertise with us. I think you've given us a ton of food for thought here, and I'm pretty certain we're going to like put a lot of these practices in place and have that moment that you talk about where like, hey, this stuff really works, right? Like, because again, it's that base level, like it's humanistic. It's what we are as people, and you're hitting it on that level and helping us put that into our classroom. So thank you both for coming on to the Hive.
Of course. Well, thanks for having us.
Everyone else, thank you so much for journeying with us here and working to sort of make next year the best year we can. And that's what we try to do every year here at the Hive is get us equipped for the next year. And I look forward to hearing how you guys are going to use this. And everybody, remember to keep checking out the Hive calendar for the events that are coming up throughout the Hive. And have a great day, everybody.
All right. Thank you.